Does anybody else find it interesting that while the Western world pushes for net zero carbon emissions by 2050, China is seeking to establish themselves at the head of the world order by 2049? The chances of two extremely ambitious plans overlapping entirely due to coincidence seems unlikely. America is responsible for roughly 15% of CO2 emissions, Canada less than 2%, and the European Union less than 10%. So, all in all, the bulk of the Western world is responsible for roughly 27% of global emissions, which is less than China alone. Now, China does have a population very similar in size to the entire Western world. However, the point is that as long as China continues to push forward with economic expansion, all efforts made by the Western world to reduce CO2 will be nullified. Almost all high-emitting developing economies are expected to increase emissions significantly by 2030. China and India are building coal-fired power stations that will double and triple their emissions respectively, while Russia, the world's fourth largest CO2 emitter, is also proposing investments that will increase its emissions substantially. Despite all of this, there is no shortage of media outlets claiming that China is leading the charge on climate change efforts by embracing green energy, but this is a load of crap. China has tripled its carbon emissions since 2000 and has seen its renewable energy use halve from almost 20% in 2000 to about 10% in 2020. According to official estimates, even if China implements all of its green energy promises, renewables will reach only 18% of their use by 2040, and fossil fuels will still account for 76% of their use. Now, I'm not trying to make the case that we should continue on as planned and pressure China to do the same. The notion that China cares what the West thinks about their policies is laughable. What I am proposing, however, is that we start holding more skepticism towards the Western world's apocalyptic storytellers. However, if before we get into things, you wouldn't mind tossing a thumbs up on this video and subscribing to our channel, that would be greatly appreciated. I first want to touch on how public messaging works. The narratives you hear about climate change from politicians and corporate journalists are not rooted in reality. There is a long game of telephone that starts with hard data, which then gets distilled into reports, which then gets distilled into summaries of reports, which then get manipulated into oversimplified talking points for politicians and journalists. Along this process, there are endless opportunities for the truth to get distorted or embellished, whether accidentally or on purpose. Daniel Botking, the former chair of environmental studies at the University of California, pointed this out when saying, quote, "Some colleagues who share some of my doubts argue that the only way to get society to change is to frighten people with the possibility of a catastrophe, and that therefore it is all right and even necessary for scientists to exaggerate. They tell me that my belief in open and honest assessment is naive." A great example of how rhetoric around climate change is faulty is the incessant use of short-term phenomena as examples of long-term trends. For instance, the WMO defines climate as a 30-year average, except media outlets and politicians will talk about changes in weather from year to year as if it is an indication of climate change. Humanity has only been keeping detailed records of weather patterns for less than a century, meaning the amount of climate cycles we've been paying close attention to could be counted on one hand. Despite this lack of long-term information, Western media outlets and political figures see no issue with making bold predictions further into the future than we have paid attention to in the past. Now, let's dive into some of the faulty science regarding this topic. There is no hard evidence showing that humanity is at risk of extinction due to climate disasters. In fact, the opposite is true. In 1920, over 500,000 people died from natural disasters compared to today's roughly 20,000 people per year, which is a 96% reduction in deaths due to extreme weather events. Every major weather event or natural disaster gets blamed on climate change. A perfect example of this is Justin Trudeau recently stating that if you need any evidence for the necessity of his out-of-control carbon tax, that you just need to look at the forest fires every summer. However, the Canadian government's own data shows that the occurrence of forest fires has been in decline for decades. The vast majority of those fires are attributed to just two factors: lightning strikes and human error. Furthermore, buried in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, you'll find that headlines about natural disasters and the raw science don't add up. In these reports, the IPCC states that they have, quote, low confidence regarding the sign of trend in the magnitude and or higher frequency of floods on a global scale, as well as, quote, low confidence in a global scale observed trend in drought or dryness since the middle of the 20th century, and lastly, quote, confidence in large-scale changes in the intensity of extreme extratropical cyclones is low. The UN's WMO even recognized this and says, quote, any single event such as a severe tropical cyclone cannot be attributed to human-induced climate change given the current status of scientific understanding. A big reason these events seem more extreme today despite being far less deadly is because even the poorest nations are much richer than 100 years ago and have more infrastructure to be affected by these disasters. It's simple. More buildings and houses equals more potential damage. These kind of headlines and oversimplifications of the climate problem is what leads us into a state of hysteria, where we believe the sky is falling and our quote-unquote experts start making claims of the end of the world. Now, let's dive into some of the faulty science which underpins the claims about eventual doom. The predictions of a future apocalypse due to climate change are built upon questionable data. All of the estimations are from computer models known as CMIPs, except here's the problem with these models. There's a belief that the different models agree, but that isn't the case at all. In fact, the findings from these models differ greatly from one another, but you wouldn't know that unless reading the fine print. When doing so, you will discover that the results being presented are quote-unquote averages from a bunch of models that disagree with one another. For instance, the simulated global average surface temperature varies among models by about 3 degrees Celsius, which is 3 times larger than the observed value of the 20th century warming that they're claiming to describe and explain. One staggering issue is that the later generation of models are actually more uncertain than the earlier ones, meaning as the models become more sophisticated, the uncertainty of their findings increased rather than decreased. Despite this, politicians and media outlets claim scientists have never been more sure of our impending doom. In the IPCC's AR4 report, they explicitly state that in general, the CMIP5 models, quote, cannot be taken as a reliable regional probability forecast. Now, let's look at the absolute mess of trying to put policies in place to change the climate. The Paris Agreement is an international treaty on climate change that was signed by 195 countries in 2015. It also happens to be the most expensive treaty in human history. It is expected that after 2030, this pact will cost us $1 to $2 trillion annually, and further down the road, it could end up costing humanity hundreds of trillions of dollars every single year. So what would we have to do in order to meet these goals? Well, the UN says we need to cut emissions by 7.6% every year. This is more than what we cut when the entire world went on lockdown in 2020, which delivered roughly 4 to 6% reduction in emissions. So what the UN is really saying is that to deal with the climate change, restrictions would have to be even more drastic than they were in 2020 until eventually 11 times the hardships in 2030. What the UN doesn't say is that seeing as any CO2 emitted stays in the atmosphere for up to 60 years, we won't even be able to measure the effect that current policies have on the climate for 6 decades at minimum. There isn't a person in their right mind that would say we should completely overhaul society to deal with a problem and then have to take a faith-based approach to deciding whether that solution will even work. Imagine putting somebody on a diet today, then checking back in 60 years from now to see if that diet worked. This approach is utter madness. Now, let's take a look at one of the countries which has adopted these green energy policies more emphatically than all others and see how it panned out for them. While the Western world tries to pivot to green energy, no one has made more extreme efforts than Germany. Now let's look at where their outrageous $580 billion spent overhauling the country's energy system has gotten them. Between the years 2000 and 2010, the country dropped its fossil fuel share from the overall energy supply from 84 to 80%, and from 2010 to 2020, usage stayed consistent and fossil fuels accounted for 79% of its energy expenditure. So 20 years and over half $500 billion later, the country is nudged a mere 5% closer to not using fossil fuels. With all of this said, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Will climate change or climate change policies bring greater harm to civilization? Let us know in the comments below. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and we'll catch you next time.